What do you make of the idea of the brain being like a filter for reality?
Many traditions from like 1,000 or more years ago have been saying is that when we come into this time-space reality as an entity here in my physical body, what happens is that our brain, in order to help us actually interact successfully and safely in this reality, has to put on filters so that we are not overwhelmed by all the sensory information coming in, the electromagnetic information coming in from the universe. And we know that that's the case. Every materialist neuroscientist knows that's the case as well. And so you only have your five senses, and your visual senses only take you from one wavelength, from like red all the way up through blue, and ultraviolet and infrared we can't see, etc. It's the same way with hearing, all of those things. So that's the first thing that happens as we come into this time-space gravity continuum. And then in terms of understanding other people, thinking about conceptuality, then our brain now puts on more filters so that we actually communicate through words. And words, once again, turn something into some sort of concrete, dead subject. And suddenly when I say the word, I only have a certain meaning to it, and I've suddenly lost the true, what do I want to say, the true connection with what that word means. I'll just give you the example. So if I say the word robin, okay, I now have just an image of a robin in mind, but I've let go of that real robin that's out there in the environment once I give it a word. So our conceptuality gets us narrower, and then we have that left-right brain split, and Ian McGilchrist has talked a lot about that. The fact that then now I have my linear brain thinking, which is what we usually use to be successful in the world, and we tend not to listen to that other side of the brain, our right brain, that is telling us about the wholeness of the universe and seeing things as a whole, and it tends to be much more intuitive, integrative, etc. And so you can see layer after layer after layer, we have shut ourselves down. And then the humor is there's something called, again, this thalamocortical circuit in our brain, which basically goes from our cortex, where all our thoughts are happening, down into our thalamus in our midbrain and back up again. And that tends to rule our awareness most of the day with our thoughts, our concerns, our egoic self, who we are, our identity. And we don't even listen to what's coming in from the outside much of the day. And I think you're probably aware of that. I'm aware that I can be walking down a beautiful forest path and I'll be lost in a thought about a conversation I had with somebody else and haven't even seen what's around me for 2 or 3 minutes. I'm on pilot. So there are the neural filters, and I've done a fair amount of research myself on this. And the beauty is that when you then look at somebody in deep meditation, what happens is this default mode network, which is we also call the mind-wandering network of the cortex, which is the one that's filling us with the narratives about our identity and the roles in the world, turns way down in deep meditation. And then we begin to have this feeling of interconnection with everything around us. We have a feeling of expansion, often of light. We begin to see, like, in our vision, more inside than we would have seen normally. And so that's one of the things that happens when the filters are turned down. And of course, with psilocybin and other of these psychoactive drugs, the same thing has happened. And this is now clearly evident in much research that's going on. And just the third one is, of course, near-death experiences, because when your heart stops, your cortex is completely shut down. You put on EEGs and it's flat. And of course, what we find is that, in fact, you now, in near-death experiences, see what's going on down the hall, conversations with the doctor down the hall, what may be going on at a far distance from you with the family, et cetera. So those are just 3 examples of what happens when these filters, which are very necessary in regular life, can be turned down. You then find a whole different way of perceiving the world and interacting with others.
Okay, Marjorie, welcome to the show. To get started, could you let us know the central thesis of your 2024 book, The Playful Universe?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I mean, that was a really fun book to create. And it was partly because when I first started working on this with David Lorimer, I knew about synchronicities. I'm a neuroscientist and I'm spiritually oriented, but I had not really focused on them in my life. And once I began focusing on them with other people, these moments that seemed incredibly significant but impossible to consider in sort of a causal fashion, that I created this in one way or another began coming up. And so what we did in that book is we invited a number of people who are academics and scientists to describe their understanding of synchronicity, and then to ask them what were the synchronicities in their lives that helped them really begin to believe this was a reality and something beyond just the normal time space causal continuum. And I found that it really solidified my understanding that this is a non dual reality that we live in, and that we can access things that are beyond time and space, I would say, and actually have these very interesting connections that shouldn't really be possible, like come up in our life, possibly from simply a sincere desire of the heart. And that sincere desire of the heart seems to draw events to you, or you to events that allow things to unfold that would otherwise not seem possible.
Beautiful. And like, so you sort of hinted at it there. I'd like you to maybe expand on it a little bit more, but what do you think this suggests about the nature of the world that we live in, that, there is this connection between what's happening between our internal experience and things that show up for us in the outside world? How can there be a connection here?
Right. And of course, I think that's the what main question of my life, and maybe your life too, in that when I was my card carrying neuroscientist at the University of Oregon doing research on things like balance control and rehabilitation after stroke, I believed that there were just five senses that helped us actually relate to the world. And if something didn't come through the five senses, it couldn't come through. And I also believe that we were not interconnected. We were separate entities. We had a brain that actually created our consciousness. And from that point of view, synchronicities are impossible. And so, literally, what happened to me after having a spiritually, what I would say, like opening, a spiritual opening, when I was about 30 years old, I began to have experiences that didn't fit into my framework. And so I was curious, and I began to do research, which actually then helped me see that we are more than our five senses, that our consciousness has what I would call inner senses that we could call that are able to connect us with other people and other situations in the world. And because we are all part of one whole, I think that that's what's really happening, is that our conscious mind, our intellect may not be aware of that interconnection, but subconsciously at some other level, we are totally connected. And if we have a great desire for something, it can draw us to events or other people that can help fulfill that desire. So I think that's that key issue. It's like once we understand that we are truly interconnected, that this is a non-local reality that goes beyond time and space, things that seem to be precognitive can happen, out of time and space can happen, interconnection can happen. And now that I've been studying this for the last like 10 or more years in terms of the nature of consciousness, I believe there's a lot of evidence to show it's possible.
In another interview, I heard you say something along the lines of, when I focus on helping others, I feel my own heart relax. And that really resonated with me. I thought there's so much power in that simple statement, and that's sort of a little hint at the nature of the world we live in, I think. Um, what do you think about things like, when someone says they have a gut instinct about something or someone, and there's very, very rarely have I ever heard somebody saying they had a gut instinct about something, ignored it, and it went well. Just any thoughts on the gut instinct and how
Well,
this might link?
It's a wonderful question. And I say that's wonderful partly because, again, when I was just the regular neuroscientist at the University of Oregon, I believed my brain was really in control of everything, and that was the part of my body that was actually truly sensing things. And now, as I've looked at more and more research, we find out that every single cell in our body has its own level of consciousness, its own level of awareness. And of course, those cells in our body are working together to make sure that we function optimally. And so then I wouldn't be surprised that, in fact, my gut would be telling me things that perhaps my intellect couldn't really hear, and letting me know by that contraction in the gut or that other feeling that I can have in my chest that this is just not a good thing. So I think, again, it's that it has that awareness, and it is an awareness that is connected with energetic levels that are occurring all around us. And it can pick that up and say, hey, wait a minute, listen up, and maybe be more cautious than you might have been otherwise.
For sure, for sure. That's a really good way to look at it. Can you tell us about the synchronicity that happened when you first met or the synchronicities that happened around the time you met your husband?
Sure. So I should say that after my meditative awakening, which was again when I was 30, I then at my next sabbatical from the University of Oregon was able to spend time with my meditation teacher. And she was traveling around the world giving talks. And I would do research for 2 or 3 months at a major university. And then I would go and spend time working with her on meditation workshops and other things of that sort. And toward the end of that academic year, I was back in the Catskill Mountains where there is an ashram that she has there. And she came in to the office where I was working and she said to me, "So, Marjorie," she said, "are you getting married?" And I said, "Well, no." I said, "I have no intention of doing that right now because I wouldn't be able to travel with you and do all these wonderful things if I were married." And she didn't say anything more to me. She talked to someone else and I sort of forgot about it. But then I got back to the University of Oregon, to Eugene, Oregon, about maybe 2 or 3 weeks later. And I had a telephone call from a person who was interested in meditation, and I had a meditation center in my house. And I told him, "Look, I'm just an ordinary university professor, nothing unusual about me, come and try it out." And he came, and when he walked in the front door, I had that total knowing that I was going to marry him. And of course, I kept quiet. That wouldn't be an appropriate thing to say to somebody that's brand new to your meditation center. And yet, what I noticed that is after I think it was about 7 weeks of coming to these meditation programs every Thursday night, he stayed after everyone else had left. And he said, "So, Marjorie, I have something to confess to you." And I said, "Well, what?" And he said, "I'm incredibly attracted to you." And I burst out laughing and I said, "Well, it took you long enough." And we were married the next year. So there is that example of that synchronicity of I mean, my teacher, my meditation teacher, knew that at this precognitive level. I had never met this man before. She knew, and she just let it be, since I had no understanding myself. But she at least probably gave me that understanding that this could unfold, and then I would understand it better. So that is one of those major ones in my life. And I should say that because we both meditate now, we have been wonderful life partners in helping each other move forward in our highest value systems in terms of being both interested in consciousness, art, and on the spiritual path.
That's an amazing story, and what a gift, that both of you guys have a very similar, I suppose, a very similar mission in life, and you're very aligned in those values. Do you think you could have gone through this life married to someone that was maybe hadn't have had a similar kind of awakening that you had?
I do not think so. In fact, I should mention that I had a boyfriend before. In fact, I met my husband Paul about 5 years for about 5 years before, and I. After I began meditating, I wanted desperately for him to actually find this path too and be comfortable with it. And I even asked my meditation teacher at one point about that, just in a letter, would this be possible? And all of the answer was is wait and see. But it was very clear that he was simply not ready in this lifetime for a spiritual path. It didn't really appeal to him. And in fact, I remember at one point I asked him, "Well, would you at least come to the local meditation center and try it out?" And that night, we had the biggest snow in Oregon we had had in a long time, and nobody could go anywhere. And that was like the end of it. And our relationship ended. And it's like, okay, certain karmic things are meant to happen and others aren't. And I think, my answer. I'm so glad that I didn't try to be with somebody and then find out that it would be really difficult for us to follow our goals that were really not going in exactly the same direction.
Yeah, it makes me wonder, like if somebody's had the kind of awakening that you had, like it must be very difficult to be in a long-term relationship with somebody that just doesn't have that same understanding and that same love for it. Because I know you've been meditating every day since you were probably 30,
Mhm.
and it must be very difficult for that your life partner not to share that with you. Um, why that meditation for you started after an experience you were on retreat with your sister, and there was an experience with a swami that was very impactful for you, and this led to you meditating pretty much every day the rest of or since.
Yeah.
Why do you think? Can you tell us about this experience, and why do you think like such this could have such a transformational effect? Like one incident, you know?
Right. And I think, first of all, just a reminder that I was this atheist neuroscience that believed again that the brain creates consciousness before that event. And I should also say that part of me was very unhappy with my life. And that's, I think, something that people note often happens before a spiritual awakening. I had done everything as a neuroscientist from material perspective to make myself happy. You know, I was in a really nice job right now. I had just come to a university in Virginia, and I was starting to teach there. I had a boyfriend, again, that same boyfriend that actually had a Porsche, and I had a beautiful place to live. And on the outside, it looked wonderful to me. A great career ahead of me. And at the same time, I was often anxious. And I would notice that if I went to a particular conference and I was on like an upper floor of a hotel, I would be worried about fires or things like that. So I could feel that there was some dis-ease inside of me, in spite of doing everything I could to have the correct life to make me happy. So walking into that particular program, then my sister had been meditating for a few years. And she had found this was very helpful for her. So she said, well, look, Marjorie, it's your birthday coming up in August, and I'll treat you to this meditation program. And she also reminds me that when I told my boyfriend about it, that I was going, he was very discouraging because he wasn't into that. And nevertheless, in fact, I think she told me that I said, no, I wasn't going to come. And then I came back and said, okay, yes, I will. She got me one of the last seats in the meditation program. And so when I first then walked into that meditation program in that first session, we were told that this Swami was going to come around and initiate every person there. And it was a spiritual awakening, and it was going to happen through the Swami's touch. Now, clearly, I'm an atheist neuroscientist. I was skeptical, but in that moment, probably because of all the things that had happened so far in my life, I was willing to put my skepticism aside and simply be open and curious about the event. And so when he came around the room and he came to me and he touched me between the eyes and on the bridge of my nose, at that moment, my eyes were closed, but I was fully engaged with all of my senses. I could feel this energy that went from his fingers between my eyes like a lightning bolt, a mini current of electricity right down to my heart. I could feel that exact point where it stopped in my body. And I could feel this radiation of energy, which felt like pure nectar, almost like golden honey, like love flowing out from me and beyond. And again, these words came to mind. Where did they come from? Only from my heart. I'm home. I'm home. My heart is my home. And I swear it was the first time in my life I had felt that feeling of being at home and having it really center on what we would call the heart. And so then, of course, what happened is that I went back home to my university position in Virginia. The very next morning, I woke up spontaneously at about 5 a.m. and I got up to meditate. I didn't know exactly what I was doing at that point, but I knew you sit up, you quiet your eyes, you focus on your breath. And I knew that just underneath that surface of my thoughts was this quiet ecstasy that I tapped in that meditation retreat, and I knew I could find it again. And the question is, what really happened? How did that stick? Because for some people, peak moments don't stick. But for me, there was some literal shift in my worldview, like a seed was planted inside of me deeply that said, this is a whole different reality than you thought it was before. And now it's time to explore that and really see how it might unfold.
Beautiful, beautiful. And you said a seed was planted there. It was obviously planted in fertile ground. You know, you were ready for whatever reason. You were ready for this. And okay, a couple of comments. There's a pattern. You know, I've noticed in people like yourself, and Bernardo Kastrup, and Federico Fagin. You know, all three of you achieved significant material success very early in life, and you got to the top of that ladder and weren't happy. You know, and gradually this led to a growing interest in the nature of consciousness, reality, and the words you used there, I'm home. I'm home. You kind of found your home there. All three of you have, you know. So it's just interesting. And it sort of reminds me of the story of the prodigal son a little bit as well, you know, like that I'm not going to go into it, but that's yeah, there's a link there. With regards to the statement I'm home, this to me brings to mind questions of things like reincarnation and, you know, the work of Ian Stevenson. Like, what are your thoughts on reincarnation? And can you maybe just share some of the findings from Ian that are shocking to say the least, you know?
Oh, sure. I mean, and I should say that once I had that awakening, I'll just take a step back to say that then over the next 20 years at the University of Oregon, I became more and more curious about consciousness and the nature of consciousness, and I meditated more deeply. And for the first time in my life, I decided to really explore this more deeply. And I decided to write this book called Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, where for myself, I went through all these different phenomena like reincarnation. And I said, I'm going to go to the literature and see what's there. Instead of letting my skepticism say, I'm not interested, I want to look firsthand. And so I, of course, discovered Ian Stevenson and a lot of his colleagues that he worked with. And I was my intellect that has still my neuroscience way of looking at things was shocked, and my heart really knew that this sounded very, very true. And I'll give you the reason for the shock from the intellect. So as a neuroscientist, one believes that it's the genes of your parents that decide who you are and your environment, and between genes and environment, that's what creates the person that I am now. And then you find out in these cases suggestive of reincarnation of Ian Stevenson that a child comes into this life. And first of all, I'll just give you one example from India. He comes into this life, and at the age of maybe, I think, about 3 or 4 years old age, he says, look, to his parents, you are not my parents. You live in this dirty house in this dirty village, and I live in this town nearby. And, my father did this or that or the other, and I was a radio shop owner. And he also then, when they actually, his older brother takes him to the radio shop where he said he was the owner, they find the wife of this man who had died of a gunshot wound from hoodlums, in effect, that he was involved with. And then when it was looked more closely, they found that the child had a scar exactly at the place where the gun shot, the bullet went into his head and then went out the other side. So you have actually a scar from the end of the previous life. And I'm going, excuse me, this is it's too much for a neuroscience to deal with. But the way that Ian Stevenson carefully did this research, he found it in so many cases that you really couldn't deny it. So those are the examples where the child and the parents of the previous life don't know each other, they find each other, and then Ian Stevenson carefully goes through all of the evidence that the child is saying he knows about, and what the parents then are saying when they've gotten together. And you have often like 14 or 15 very clear statements that couldn't have happened other than the child coming back, knowing everything from that previous life, even with physical marks on that. And that's just one of the examples. Of course, there are many. And I think one of the ones that's in the United States is James Leininger, previously known as James Houston, who was the airplane pilot that was shot down in World War II. So there's one more example that is very, very strong in a similar sort of way.
And do you want to share what that you brought it up? Do you want to share it? Please do.
Oh yeah, I mean, that was another one. And I'll just again give you a funny lead up to that. My husband, of course, is spiritual like me. He found that book and he decided to give it to his father, who had been in World War II, for a present. And so he gave it to him for Christmas, and his father never opened it because he was not interested in reincarnation at all. And so we picked it up from him, a number of years later. And that was the first time I had actually then read it. And as I read it, I could not believe the story. So once again, it's this little boy in Texas who starts having nightmares when he's like 2 to 2.5 years of age and saying, airplane on fire. Little man can't get out. And he's like pushing up, like against, like he's trying to get out of his cockpit. And the nightmares go on. He's drawing pictures of this. He's telling stories to his dad. And at some point, he's sitting on his dad's lap, and the dad has opened up a beautiful picture book related to the Battle of Iwo Jima and other battles in Japan of World War II. And at one particular page, when the little boy's on his lap, he says, I was in that um, place, Dad, and that's where I died. And so his dad goes, what? And then he actually says, well, do you know what boat you were on? And I think he actually said the exact name of the boat. And again, the father thinks about it doesn't really sound Japanese, but in fact, it was exactly right. And then as the dad, who is a total skeptic, he's a fundamentalist Christian and thinks this can't be possible. When his dad begins to go on the web and look at World War II and find out all the things his son is telling him, everything comes to pass that is true. And I think the most amazing part was then he decides to take the boy to a reunion of the men that were on this ship that he was on. And one of the men actually sees him coming down the hall, and the man says to James, do you know who I am? And James says, oh, yes, you're, I can't remember if it was his name was Jack or something like that, but this is who you are. And the man says, how do you know? He says, I know your voice. So it was, again, it makes your hair stand on end, the amount that he knew. And in that case, they even went back to talk to the relatives that were still alive from the other James Houston's life, and they said that everything that the young James was talking to them about were very true. I mean, he said things about the family and some alcohol problems and things of that sort were all correct. So, I mean, there's an American version, there was an Indian version, and of course, Ian Stevenson and others have many, many more. Jim Tucker, after Ian Stevenson ended up passing away, had continued that research almost to this day. So, what do we say about that? I don't know, but getting back to your question is, does that mean that there might have been something in my past that I was now coming home to and that understanding? I would say absolutely yes.
Wow, wow. Yeah, we interviewed Christopher Betch for the podcast, and one of the things he shared that kind of really stood out for me in that interview was this idea that, just because somebody might be like considered an old person or an adult or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean they are an old soul, for example. So he sort of has a view that people come into this life with different starting points, and it's not uncommon to find someone that might be like a teenager or someone in the early 20s, and they've actually got what you might call an old soul. And you might find somebody that's in their 70s or 80s, and they don't kind of have that kind of um that way about them. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, yes, because I'll just bring in briefly, or we can go into it in more detail, but my work now with the children that are autistic and non speaking that have telepathy. And I've been doing that research now for about the last 9 months, almost a year. And as I'm interviewing them and their parents, again, I want to say that this is with Marina Weiler at the University of Virginia and also with Diane Hennessy, who is a neuropsychiatrist. And when I'm interviewing these children, of course, the only way they can communicate is having learned to communicate via a letterboard because they cannot speak or they can only speak very, very limited ways. They type out things about you and about the people around them that show that they are incredibly wise, they're compassionate, they say things in beautiful, often poetic ways, and you're thinking they're wise well beyond their age. And they have this neurodiversity and these limitations that keep them from communicating normally, and it's almost as if it has opened them up to a wider interconnection with reality because those filters on the brain that normally come into our lives with all of our language and concepts that are constraining us aren't there for them. And they are. Um, they're amazingly beautiful, creative individuals, and they feel interconnected with everybody else. And it's like they cannot tell a lie because they know the truth of interconnection. And they also know other people's thoughts. And I should say that this one man, I asked him at one point, well, um, do you hear everybody's thoughts? And he said, well, actually, I usually do. But he said, it's not comfortable some of the time because their thoughts are not high thoughts. And I try to stay away from those sort of people.
Wow, wow! Can people access any information about this online? Is there anything been published yet, or is it still in the early stages?
So we just last night at 7 o'clock Pacific time, where I am, submitted our first article to a journal, and we'll see how that all unfolds because this is a topic that is controversial, clearly. And I should mention, I didn't even know about this type of amazing autism in children with this type of telepathy in children with autism until Diane Hennessy had emailed me and said, Marjorie, I'm doing this work with Kai Dickens related to autistic children and telepathy. And we want to have a credible neuroscientist on the show to talk about whether this might be possible. And so I didn't know anything about it. And I was asked to listen to the first 3 episodes before I was interviewed. And once I started listening on the morning of my interview, I started just to see what it was about. I couldn't stop. I was just glued to what these children were able to do. And I thought, wow, I want to help understand this. And I realized that sort of what you're saying is true, that there is very little research on this because Diane Hennessy is a neuropsychiatrist. She's a clinician. She's not at a university. She doesn't have the opportunity to really go in and do careful papers. She's busy as a clinician. And so I said to her, can I help you publish the data? And Marina Weiler at the University of Virginia, also a neuroscientist, was very interested in doing this too. And so the three of us are now doing this research together. And I'm blown away every time I have another interview with the family. So yes, it's unbelievable. And I should say, I'll just give you one little example. So, for example, with some of the data that had been collected by Diane in the past, she was asking these children to tell us what numbers were being shown to their mother or the therapist that was out of their sight. And in one case, the therapist had a barrier between the child and the therapist. And the therapist was then looking at a set of like 5-digit numbers or words or things like that, and then asking the child to go ahead in their letterboard and type in what was in the therapist's mind. And she was right on. She was like, I don't know, 95, 97% accurate. And another child was 100% accurate. Another one was, somewhere between 95 and 100% over many trials. Now, just to put that in context, Dean Radin and others have done a lot of work on telepathy. And what they have shown in the normal human being, if you give them something like 4 possible choices to see if they know which one is the accurate choice related to what the other person is thinking, they are 5% above chance. In other words, they do it 30% of the time instead of 25% of the time, which would be what you'd expect from chance. So 5% above chance compared to 95 to 100% accurate when they don't even know what is in their mother's mind except through telepathy is mind boggling to me. And so when I saw that and heard that and began interacting with them, I said to Diane, may I please work with you and help you take this further? And I'm ecstatic in doing that. It's just this the joy of being a researcher. I mean, in some ways, Niall, you're your own researcher doing all of these podcasts and going and you're the weekend university. And I get to be in the sandbox with the kids and with these other scientists, understanding things that I didn't believe were possible before. And that is a lot of fun.
I love it. I love it. Okay, what was the sample size for this study
So
roughly?
that particular study that is basically 3 cases. So again, Diane Hennessy is a neuropsychiatrist. She went to the home of one child and collected data with cameras and other people around to make sure it was very carefully controlled. She then went to the home of another child with the therapist and made up the split barrier between the two of them and had cameras. And then a third child, it was the same way. So that is the start. So she had collected the data, and then I came in with Marina and another Charles Yokoyama is now helping us get this into publication, and we are simply carefully analyzing the data. It's like video frame by video frame to say what is happening and what is going on. So we're taking it to that deeply scientific level of how much can we say about the true accuracy of this, and could there be any leakage of information? That can the child see the mother, can the child not see the mother, can the child could they have seen the letters, whatever, so we can rule out as much as possible. So that's this first study, and now we're in ongoing studies where we're now being more careful about doing many children and then seeing what we really find out about their telepathic abilities.
Incredible. Yeah, it's you have a you mentioned there, but it's almost like you're in a sandbox playing, and you're having such fun with your work, and it's so important too. But I've heard you say something elsewhere that is, I think it's worth mentioning here. Like you're able to do this work and have the impact that you are able to have. The same with Bernardo, the same with Federico, and a lot of people in this world, because all of you have had sort of parallel paths in your study of consciousness. And this is really important, I think. This is implications for anybody that is really interested in this subject and wants to do work in this area, this parallel approach. Can you just share your thoughts here?
Oh, absolutely. I often have told graduate students that would like to work with me, if you want to work on things like telepathy, on the nature of consciousness and whether it's fundamental, you need to also have a parallel track at the university that a materialist department head would also be interested in, and do them simultaneously so that while you're working to get tenure in an established university that wants something that's very quantitative and very part of the norm, you can be doing that, but then you can do these other things that are much more exciting for me, of really answering deep questions about reality. But you do that at the same time, and therefore you're able to move through. Once you get tenure, of course, you're fine. And Niall, I should also say that sometimes I feel poignant about the fact that the reason people listen to me right now is because I was a neuroscientist with grants from National Institutes of Health, with papers in very, very good journals, doing research on, again, stroke, Parkinson's rehabilitation. I have a textbook out that's in its sixth edition. People trust me in the regular scientific and academic environment. And so they're willing to listen to me when I talk about telepathy and after death communication and reincarnation. They may not be completely open, but they know that I have been credible for the past 35 years of my life doing that research. And so that is the rub, we might say, about doing this research. You have to establish your credibility as much as you can, and then go ahead and branch out and say, look, knowing that I have the tools to try to be as careful as I can in controlling the study, and I'm going to do that so that I can prove to you that this is a real phenomenon.
Yeah, it's so important. So important. Um, what do you make of the idea of the brain being like a filter for reality?
Well, I love that you asked that question, because I think that was the first thing that came to me as I started looking at research on near-death experiences, meditation, psilocybin, etc. And it was this: it's that what I think a lot. I'll even take a step back. What many traditions from like 1,000 or more years ago have been saying is that when we come into this time-space reality as an entity here in my physical body, what happens is that our brain, in order to help us actually interact successfully and safely in this reality, has to put on filters so that we are not overwhelmed by all the sensory information coming in, the electromagnetic information coming in from the universe. And we know that that's the case. Every materialist neuroscientist knows that's the case as well. And so you only have your five senses, and your visual senses only take you from one wavelength, from like red all the way up through blue, and ultraviolet and infrared we can't see, etc. It's the same way with hearing, all of those things. So that's the first thing that happens as we come into this time space gravity continuum. And then, in terms of understanding other people, thinking about conceptuality, then our brain now puts on more filters so that we actually communicate through words. And words, once again, turn something into some sort of concrete, dead subject. And suddenly, when I say the word, I only have a certain meaning to it, and I've suddenly lost the true, what do I want to say, the true connection with what that word means. I'll just give you the example. So if I say the word robin, okay, I now have just an image of a robin in mind, but I've let go of that real robin that's out there in the environment once I give it a word. So our conceptuality gets us narrower, and then we have that left-right brain split, and Ian McGilchrist has talked a lot about that. The fact that then now I have my linear brain thinking, which is what we usually use to be successful in the world, and we tend not to listen to that other side of the brain, our right brain, that is telling us about the wholeness of the universe and seeing things as a whole, and it tends to be much more intuitive, integrative, etc. And so you can see layer after layer after layer, we have shut ourselves down. And then the humor is there's something called, again, this thalamocortical circuit in our brain, which basically goes from our cortex, where all our thoughts are happening, down into our thalamus in our midbrain and back up again. And that tends to rule our awareness most of the day with our thoughts, our concerns, our egoic self, who we are, our identity. And we don't even listen to what's coming in from the outside much of the day. And I think you're probably aware of that. I'm aware that I can be walking down a beautiful forest path, and I'll be lost in a thought about a conversation I had with somebody else and haven't even seen what's around me for 2 or 3 minutes. I'm on pilot. So there are the neural filters, and I've done a fair amount of research myself on this. And the beauty is that when you then look at somebody in deep meditation, what happens is this default mode network, which is we also call the mind wandering network of the cortex, which is the one that's filling us with the narratives about our identity and the roles in the world, turns way down in deep meditation. And then we begin to have this feeling of interconnection with everything around us. We have a feeling of expansion, often of light. We begin to see like in our vision more inside than we would have seen normally. And so that's one of the things that happens when the filters are turned down. And of course, with psilocybin and other of these psychoactive drugs, the same thing has happened. And this is now clearly evident in much research that's going on. And just the third one is, of course, near death experiences, because when your heart stops, your cortex is completely shut down, you put on EEGs and it's flat. And of course, what we find is that in fact, you now in near death experiences see what's going on down the hall, conversations with the doctor down the hall, what may be going on at a far distance from you with the family, et cetera. So, those are just three examples of what happens when these filters, which are very necessary in regular life, can be turned down. You then find a whole different way of perceiving the world and interacting with others. And I think the kids with telepathy who have non-speaking autism never develop those filters in that way, and that's why they're so much more open to telepathy and interconnection.
It's, whenever you really wrap your head around that, it's such an important idea. The idea that, we're only really tuning into a tiny spectrum of a much bigger world, and like only what our five senses can give us access to. And for me, I think that has implications because, it sort of suggests that the brain is a receiver of consciousness. And if we know that we can influence sort of how our brain tunes into the world around us, that, there's a big responsibility on the individual to make sure that they are perceiving as clearly as they can. Any
Absolutely.
thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, and I wanted to bring in something that Bernardo Kastrup has said because he and Federico Pashin are two of my wonderful friends talking about these things. And we have differences and we have similarities. But one of the things Bernardo said in his book, More Than Allegory, and I highly recommend that to people who haven't read it, is this, that any being, any entity that comes into this time space continuum that we're all sitting in together um, brings beliefs with them in order to interact. And he gives the example that if there is a mountain, that mountain had to believe in gravity to be a mountain in this time space continuum. There are all those beliefs. So we have the belief in time being linear, space three-dimensional, et cetera, gravity, and then all these other belief systems that we have in terms of our ways, causality, for example. And the point is that those beliefs are so deeply embedded in us that we don't know how to change them. I can intellectually say, well, I'd like to be able to fly, but there's this deep belief that I can't fly because of my belief in gravity. And Bernardo's point is that the only way to shift our perception is to really get underneath a belief like that and root it out. And that's the only way it's going to happen. And of course, the beliefs are very useful much of the time. But I think what happens is that, again, I'm taking the children with non speaking autism, they never even had some of those beliefs because they weren't interacting with people in the normal ways that one would. So some of those things in terms of their neurodiversity have been very helpful for them in allowing them, because they couldn't communicate in the normal way, they had to communicate via telepathy, and they developed it to this fine refined degree. I mean, I think you've probably heard about them talking about this hill where many of them go to. And again, kids from different parts of the country all use that same word. They go to the hill where they can talk to other kids, and they're talking totally telepathically. And so I'm thinking, wow. So for whatever the reason, they didn't have to like even worry about suspending that belief because that came to them from the beginning. In fact, just a brief aside, in this questionnaire that we're giving these young people that have these problems, when we asked them how long were they aware that they were telepathic, they usually said, I've always known it, which means they sometimes literally mean like from in the womb or just when they were born. They have always known they were telepathic. The parents, when we ask when they knew, they say, oh, well, maybe it was when he first started actually using the letterboard and communicating with me, because then he could tell me, Mom, I knew you were doing this by the letterboard when you were away. Or they know it because the child is always able to find the Christmas presents or the food that they had hidden from the child, and the child knows exactly where they put them. So I think that the key for me is that what meditation does, and perhaps psilocybin, but I would say meditation and also certain ways of training, like in fact remote viewing training, allow us to put aside those belief systems so that we can get in touch with something that allows us to perceive what is going on outside our normal time space continuum.
Wow. Wow. Whenever we're talking about this idea of the brain being a receiver or being a filter, something that regularly comes to mind for me is, you know, Bernardo talks about like his daimon, for example. I interviewed Richard Schwartz, and he's a creator of internal family systems therapy, and a lady called Martha Beck there a few weeks ago. And I asked them, both of them have, changed millions of lives around the work through their work. And I asked them, what percentage of your your impact, your contribution has came from spiritual guidance, or what they quite explicitly call guides that they communicate with. And both just said 100%, 100%. It wasn't them, you know? So, if we are living in this kind of much bigger reality, but we've only got access to this tiny kind of spectrum of it, it is certainly within the realm of possibility that there are other entities outside of what we can perceive with our five senses interacting with the human world. And sounds if I had said that a few years ago, I would have said, I can't believe I'm saying this, is crazy. But the more I've got into this, I'm just like, it's possible. What do you think about that?
See, I totally agree with you. And I couldn't have agreed with you before I had that awakening at the age of 30, because neuroscientists say that's impossible. And it's only weak minded people that would believe that, is what we all thought when I was a young neuroscientist. But now, from again the work I've been doing with after death communication. And there's another thing, I'll just take a step back. I was giving a talk at the Beyond the Brain meeting in London. I think it was maybe in 2019, and Chris Rowe was there, and he is a psychologist, and he does research in England on after death communication. And he and his colleagues, I think Evelyn Elsesser is one of them, we're basically getting information from people around the world that had had an after death communication from a family member in this case. And they were just trying to find out, what can we say about this? Can it have a reality to it, or is it just an illusion, as I might have thought of before, meaning that it's just a thought in my mind. I'm sad that my mother's gone. And so a thought comes in and I say, oh, I had a communication from her. And as they asked me at that point, Marjorie, you're a neuroscientist. Would you like to take part in analyzing these data and see what you can say about some aspect? And I said, I'd love to look at the sensory perceptions that these people are having, and what can we say about their reality? And so that's what I did. And I'll just give you one quick story about that, and then we'll get on to the guides too, because I think that's the next step afterwards. This one particular man said that he was asleep at 6 a.m. in the morning, something like that, and he heard a knock on the door. And he got up, he got dressed, he went to the door, he looked out, and he saw that it was a woman that was facing away from him, and she was crying. And so he opened the door to say, well, what's wrong? And he saw it was his grandmother. Now, she had been dead for 7 years. She comes to him and she says, I just want to ask for your forgiveness, because after your father died, I didn't talk to you for the next 7 years until I died. And I really feel terrible. And she said, will you forgive me? And of course, he said yes. And they gave each other this big hug. And he said, I could feel her frail bones in my hands and my arms. He said she was actually so bright, though, with light at this point, that I had to close my eyes. And he said, when I continued to hug her, the light began to go away, diminish, and then I opened my eyes and I was just holding empty space. And again, he goes inside to tell his wife, and he can't believe what had happened because it felt so real. So there's one example of a grandmother that comes back to talk to you. And then there's the other thing about these spiritual guides that may connect with you. And I do a certain amount of work with Suzanne Giesman, who is a medium in the United States that helps people connect with guides and also with their loved ones on the other side. And in watching the work she's doing, I find that her own guides, who she says have named themselves Sanaya, are so wise in what they have to say to her. And they literally give her like about a paragraph to share with other people every single morning when she gets up to meditate. And I read those paragraphs, and they are wise beyond words. And they often help me get out of some conundrum I'm in by listening to their guidance. So I believe in guides, and I think different people have different guides. And I think always the issue people might be asking is, how can you trust that it's not just your mind? And I think you have to look at the results of listening and saying, you use your rational mind to say, does this seem reasonable? And so you wouldn't necessarily do something that really seemed way off base. But I think that, yes, that um, we are in a time space continuum that goes beyond time and space. And there are these entities, quote unquote, you could call them on the other side, but that just means they're not within our five senses perception. There are these other entities that are really all around us, trying to help and protect us and uplift us. And why not open ourselves to their loving guidance if and when we can?
Beautiful, beautiful. This is a slightly big, I say big picture. It's all been big picture. Slightly bigger picture question. When you think about the nature of reality, the nature of being itself, I think it was Thomas Aquinas basically equated God with being in the sense that it's in everything and everyone, right? When you think about the nature of that, what are the things that come to mind? What are the things that spring to mind for you? Like, what's your image of what that thing is, the ground of being?
That's a wonderful question. And I think from my own experience and also from my just reading and sharing, etc., I believe that this is, of course, an infinite awareness that is in pure potential form at one level, and also is incredibly creative and wants to know itself. And therefore, in wanting to know itself, literally creates what I would call subunits of consciousness, individual consciousness units, which are us and everything else around it, so that it can know itself through each one of us interacting with each other and everything else around it. And I believe it creates great joy in doing this. And here is the rub, it's that once this happens, you move into a realm of duality. And once you're in, you go from infinite awareness to time space continuum, you're into duality, and therefore you have pleasure and you have pain. And I think from that higher perspective, in Kashmir Shaivism, is called the Shiva Drishti perspective, which just simply means the perspective of absolute consciousness. You can see one person coming on the stage as a baby and another person leaving the stage as they die, and everything is okay. It's part of the joy of the drama of the universe. It's the play of consciousness. And so you don't see one as bad and one as good. So that's the perspective from what I would call the container of everything. And for me as an individual, what I'm always trying to do is see if I can expand my container back to that size where I can see the joy of creativity and the fact that everything changes, everything that begins has to end, and it's okay. And I'll give you one humorous example. I have been talking to a friend of mine, and we joke about the fact that we keep thinking we came into this time space reality for a pleasure cruise. And what we got was a learning cruise. And to me, that's the key issue. When something is going not the way I wanted it, when it's a little more painful or sad, or I feel suffering, it's because I'm learning to be perhaps a more gentle, loving, compassionate human being to see well beyond myself instead of just my own individual desires. And so I have to let go of the thought that it was supposed to be just a pleasure cruise. I love the pleasure, but I'm also learning that anytime that things don't go well and I begin to feel suffering, there's something I can learn to help expand my awareness back to that full understanding.
So suffering almost serves the function of burning away the illusions of the smaller self, the egos, so that you can reconnect to that bigger awareness.
Absolutely.
On that note of, the universe wants to know itself. When I spoke to Chris Bates, who I mentioned earlier, um, he takes a slightly different angle on that. He thinks that this, whatever we call that, the universe, God, source, or whatever, his view is more that it's here to evolve itself. It's here to create itself. And whenever you talk to people like Ian McGilchrist, he'll tell you that it's, we're in a co-creative process with that thing. And to me, that seems to be more aligned with my own experience. This idea that it's co-creative, and it doesn't. There's no like. It's still finding out through us, and that's why creativity is so rewarding, because we're bringing something new into the world. And I think that's part of the reason why human beings are here. Is it?
Absolutely. And I think that is a both and. I don't think it's one or the other. I think that it wants to know itself and it does that through this creative process, which is an evolutionary process, as you say. And I mean, I should also mention, so speaking of guides from the other side, I work with a group over in Bend, Oregon, and my friend that leads that group has been very interested in the Seth material from Jane Roberts that was channeled material from way back in the 70s and 80s, et cetera. And one of the things that, in fact, Seth says about this is that you can see how consciousness is evolving through our history where we have all of this information. And one of the things that I thought was intriguing is he says, for example, if you look back at the Renaissance, when we had these amazing artists that were painters and sculptors, they were using a medium that was like, in some ways, like new to them at that day, where they could really explore all these pigments of the paints and get the color that was exactly right for them to express something they wanted. And now, 500 years later, we aren't doing that because it's like we have moved into a new era of technology where we are doing different things with our creativity. And it doesn't mean that one is good or one is bad. It just means that we as consciousness are evolving in different ways. And now we're in a whole different situation. And we are now using our creativity in other ways. So I think it's fascinating to watch that process of unfolding and creativity and evolution, which is, for me, the self wanting to know itself and joyously going through this process.
A playful universe, as you've called it. Um, yeah, something I wonder about too is values, things like truth, things like goodness, beauty, and my own experience of life has been that the closer I stay to these things, like these sort of universal principles or whatever, the better my life seems to flow. And when I stray from them, I, things get chaotic very fast. And it sort of seems that, like, when we talked about Ian McGilchrist earlier, like his view is that I asked him, I was like, Ian, what do you think the purpose of life is? He was like, his hypothesis, from what I remember, was something along the lines of it's to embody these values and give expression to them through our lives and through our actions. And I just wonder your thoughts on values, things like, why is it so important to stay close to truth? Like, any thoughts about, like, are the rules to the game we're playing here? Like, it seems like it's set up that way.
Yeah. And again, in answering that, I'll take a step back to the fact that when Galileo and the church had their argument back, whenever in the 1500s or whatever, and the church basically said to Galileo, I'm not going to look through your telescope. And Galileo said, okay, we'll make a deal, along with Descartes and others, that we will deal with just the physical universe, sensory perceptual phenomena, et cetera, physicality. And the church can go ahead and deal with values and the spirit and consciousness. And that was when we got into trouble as science, because then we threw out values, and values are the most important thing in the world. It's like you can't separate them out that way. And so I think that what Ian McGilchrist is saying is absolutely true, that without value, and that's what we're finding in terms of, like, the nuclear warheads that are around. It's like, yet if you create those things without a value system, you're in real trouble about destroying the universe. You have to have value in every bone of your body as you're thinking and creating and doing things. And part of that value system is, I think, what I would say, the non-dual nature of reality, that we are truly interconnected with everything else around us in the universe, and we are truly connected in time and space and beyond space. So whatever I'm doing now affects everything around me, my thoughts, my beings. And don't I want that to be uplifting and creative and joyful when at all possible? And as you say, think about other people and you will become happier. I mean, try to help other people. I just, in relation to that, I was with Chris Bache at a conference about a year and a half ago, and he gave a workshop on some of the dire things that could happen if we don't get our act together as human beings and really change the way we treat the environment. And I was feeling very depressed when I was at the end of the workshop. And I went back to my room and I realized that the fear in the beginning was that I could see awful things that might be happening to me in that sort of environment. And all of a sudden, I realized that all I had to do was shift to saying, how could I help others if those things do happen? Everything changed for me. Suddenly, there was a feeling of love in my heart. And I could say, whatever happens, if I can just focus on helping those around me, I'll be fine. And what a lesson in values again, value of this whole universe and how we can really help nurture it in any way we can.
That's a beautiful example and so empowering too. I think what it shows is that your individual agency and actions really do matter in the grand scheme of things. And for me, whenever we spoke earlier about the nature of being, the ground of being, and whenever I do link that with the values question, for me, it seems that nature of being, or God, or the universe, whatever you want to call it, its qualities are the values that we, think about, like truth, goodness, beauty, patience, creativity, curiosity, etc., etc. That is the nature of that thing. And I think the closer we are, like the closer our actions align with that, the closer we are to that being. And it's ridiculously simple, but ridiculously hard as well. But anyway, before we wrap up, Marjorie, this has been such an amazing conversation. You've shared so much wisdom and insights and fascinating research. Is there anything that you haven't shared today that you would love to leave us with? Any final thoughts?
Well, I think just reiterating what you said about the nature of whatever we want to call it, this loving, the source, conscious awareness, whatever that is, infinite and from which we are a part. I mean, it's immanent, it's transcendent, it's both. And we are that. It's like if we can just hold on to that awareness and that interconnection, my own intuition is that we won't have any problems. It's only when I begin to feel separate from others and then, in some ways, concerned about myself as a separate individual, a separate island, that I lose that. And then I remember, oh, I can just reach out for connection. I can reach out for help. I can offer help. And then suddenly I feel that same connection you're talking about. And what a lesson. As you say, it's hard to do sometimes, but if we can keep our intention on that sort of focus, I think we will do well in life.
For sure, for sure. Where can people find you online, get your books, and learn more about the research and the work that you're doing?
Sure. First of all, my website is marjoriewoollacott.com, all one word. And also, my book, Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, is about my own journey. But then, as you mentioned, as the president of the Academy for the Advancement of Postmaterialist Sciences, we have been publishing these beautiful edited books on things like synchronicity and spiritual awakenings. And we're going to be doing one, in fact, I think in another year, on reincarnation. And soon this summer, we're having one come out on wisdom in science, which is what you and I were talking about. How can we help scientists understand that values are critical for whatever they're doing in their laboratory? So I'm hoping people will enjoy those essays from scientists about how they can be the best possible human being, really.
Brilliant. Marjorie, you're a force of nature. I want to wish you the best with your work going forward, and I'll be keeping a close watch.
Thank you, Niall.
If you enjoyed this episode, you might also enjoy getting our 7 Insights newsletter. This is a once per month email where I share 7 of the most valuable insights I've uncovered in the previous 30 days. It includes book, podcast, and documentary recommendations, as well as questions and quotes specifically curated to help you live a more creative, intentional, and meaningful life. It currently goes out to over 50,000 subscribers each month. And if you're interested in joining them, you can sign up via the link in the description.